Right, so as I spoke about in another recent video, Keir Starmer and Labour have been polling Muslim voters to gauge how much damage has been done to the party's reputation amongst a demographic they have historically always been able to rely on, given the party's incessant support for Israel. Starmer's admission that Israel have the right to cut off water, food and fuel, something he has never apologised for, has just denied ever saying, despite it being on TV, on film forever and a day, saying otherwise. Starmer has led his party in lockstep with the Tories on this matter and abstained when the SNP put forward a vote on a ceasefire amendment last November. He has taken that Muslim vote for granted, and the people are turning their backs on his party and looking at other options because of it. Other options which are rapidly making themselves known as independents and community organised candidates step up to represent a lot of people for whom they feel quite justifiably do not represent them anymore. Now, polling done by the Labour Muslim Network showed Labour might have lost as much as half of their Muslim voter base. But has Labour's internal polling shown it is that bad as well, or worse? Frankly, it's the only explanation for Starmer's most recent speech. Right, so Labour's Muslim vote, it sunk from a high of 86% under Jeremy Corbyn to potentially as low as 43% under Starmer, according to the Labour Muslim Network, though that stat does include don't knows. It was publicised previously that as long as Labour's support amongst Muslims didn't fall below something like 20%, Labour could get away with ignoring them. So this about-face from Starmer, or what appears to be, I've got issues with it, in the form of a speech to the Scottish Labour conference yesterday, appears to have U-turned on a ceasefire. Given how beholden to the Zionist lobby he and his party are, well, it strikes me that his internal polling might actually be a damn sight worse than the Labour Muslim Network's findings, and sufficiently so to be a threat to Starmer's dreams of entering number 10. Now, the Zionist lobby know he's their man. Him changing his tune now for cynical political gain, for damage limitation, well, they'll probably understand that, I would think. Once in power, no longer needing votes from anyone, he'll do as always intended, I'm sure. First impressions of people do matter, after all. Starmer has failed to stand against Israel repeatedly, changing his tune now with the list of lies he's got to his name by this point, 4 years into his leadership. You'd have to be a right fool to believe him. For a start, what has actually changed? The ICJ provisional orders and ruling came down weeks ago. He can't say that is his reason. Netanyahu's batshit rhetoric and that of his far-right coalition partners have been going on for months. He can't put it down to them either. Is it just a case now that he had a number of deaths in mind, a target, a goal that has finally been reached? Was it the 12,000 dead children his limit? 19,000 children orphaned? 30,000 deaths, all in? Was that the target he had in mind? The only thing that has actually changed is the death toll. And as a former human rights lawyer, does he really only see these people as numbers at the end of the day? Now, my opinion of Starmer is a low one. But if it ever comes out that that has any ring of truth to it, my opinion of him will go far, far lower. I think it more likely that his run at number 10 is under threat because the Muslim vote has abandoned him in larger numbers than might have previously been thought. But let's turn to what he said to Scottish Labour conference upon returning from a security conference in Munich first.
An end to the fighting, not just now, not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts, conference, that is what must happen now. The fighting must stop now. Our conference. Any ceasefire cannot be one-sided. It must stop all acts of violence on both sides. And it must lead to a genuine peace process. Because the offensive threatened on Rafah, a place where 1.5 million people are now cramped together in unimaginable conditions, with nowhere else for them to go, this cannot become a new theatre of war. That offensive cannot happen. And even in these most terrible of circumstances, the two-state solution must be back on the table. A safe and secure Israel, where the horror that Hamas inflicted on October the 7th, the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust, could never happen again. and alongside that, a viable Palestinian state, a state which is not in the gift of any neighbour, but is an inalienable right of the Palestinian people and is recognised by this party and the world.
An end to the fighting, not just now, not just for a pause, but permanently. A ceasefire that lasts. Conference, that is what must happen now. The fighting must stop now. His words. No longer is he talking humanitarian pauses. He's talking permanent ceasefire. And you have to remember who he is talking to here. Scottish Labour have been backing a ceasefire for a while. They have bucked the National Party. They've been shaming them fundamentally. They actually passed a motion for an immediate ceasefire the day before Starmer addressed them. So for Starmer to turn up and actually say anything else to them, well, we'd be talking about him having had a car crash conference appearance possibly, instead of what many are saying is a big shift and a bid to win back those Muslim voters I suspect he's lost an awful lot of. Here's the thing though, calling for a permanent ceasefire without saying when isn't a change in position for Starmer at all. He has said before he wants the fighting to end and that it takes both sides, but without saying when. Now you might say, but Damo, you're contradicting yourself here. He said now. He wants a permanent ceasefire now. Except he didn't. He said he wants the fighting to stop now. He said the fighting has to stop now. He wants a permanent, sustainable ceasefire that leads to a genuine peace process, but didn't say when in relation to that. We all want the fighting to stop, but a ceasefire is a political stance requiring negotiation, and without the US on board, and they are still ruling out a ceasefire, there's actually no movement here. Starmer also isn't in power, and he might think this puts the Tories in an awkward spot, but it doesn't, not really, because they still hold a working majority. Would enough Tories join with the SNP ceasefire vote to change that? Well, none of them did before, so there's no point assuming any would now, is there? And of course that brings me on to the bigger question of whether Starmer would, because of course, if he means a permanent ceasefire now, why did he not say an immediate ceasefire instead? That is, after all, the wording of the SNP Opposition Day vote coming this Wednesday, which will be a vote for an immediate call for a ceasefire. It won't deliver one, but it shows intent. It actually would do Labour no harm to back it. It would do them more harm not to. But, and it's a big but, you have to recall that when the SNP laid down their ceasefire amendment last November, Labour abstained, apparently because Starmer felt to agree with the SNP would damage their chances in Scotland. Now, of course, Scottish Labour are on board with a ceasefire. It would surely damage Labour's chances to not agree with a ceasefire, particularly in light of Starmer's recent appearance at their conference. But an immediate one? Will Starmer vote for that? Vote accordingly? Well, we will find out on Wednesday, won't we? It would also prove Starmer was wrong about Scottish voter feeling. Not that being wrong for him is anything new, but admitting it would be. Starmer made a pretty speech in Scotland. They lapped it up. Those that were there, anyway. The Guardian claimed it was the biggest showing of Labour members at a Scottish conference in Scotland for decades. But this picture implies otherwise. That hall only holds about 500 people and was definitely not full, so pathetic shilling from the liberal mainstream press and a show of what a turn-off Starmer is, even amongst his own party and members, and likely in no small part due to his ongoing refusal to back an immediate ceasefire. But hey, maybe he did mean it and just didn't mention it, eh? Well, we've only got until Wednesday to find out, don't we? Because the SNP motion calls for an immediate ceasefire, condemnation of Israel's attacks on Rafah, which Starmer also made mention of, and the crisis affecting the people trapped there, and condemns the collective punishment by Israel on all Palestinians. Labour have apparently claimed they are in discussions with the SNP over their ceasefire motion, which has built up some excitement and some expectation amongst their supporters. But it should come as no surprise that the SNP's Westminster spokesman, Stephen Flynn, has shot this down, tweeting out, "The Labour Party has stated that they are in discussions with the SNP on our immediate ceasefire motion. This is not true. Nevertheless, I am more than willing to meet with Sir Keir Starmer to discuss this hugely important issue prior to Wednesday's vote." Why lie about it then, Keith? It's a big stretch for Starmer to go there and back that vote on Wednesday. If he does, then for one, I think he's probably been given permission to by the lobby, and for two, he's figured it's worth it even if he doesn't mean it later on, which would be completely in keeping with Starmer, because when is Starmer's word worth anything? If he abstains again, or worse, then this was all a load of hot air for the Scottish faithful, and nothing more. Hot air, summing up 4 years of Starmer's leadership. Besides, did David Lammy give the game away on Laura Coonsbrig's show on Sunday regarding Starmer's true intent on the SNP ceasefire motion, despite what Starmer said in Scotland later on? I'll find out all about that little story on this video recommendation here, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.